Clea is a 2021 Knauss Fellow working as an Ocean Science Policy Advisor in the National Science Foundation's Division of Ocean Sciences. She completed her undergraduate work at Colby College and earned a master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island in 2020. Throughout her studies, Clea's work has focused on how people use and think about marine spaces, with emphasis on coastal fisheries, marine protected areas, and equity. Today, Clea will be presenting on her work at the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. She will share interview data with New England fishers to explore the effectiveness of methods used to communicate about shipwreck protection guidelines, the impact of guidelines on fishing practices, and general perceptions of shipwreck protection efforts. Thank you, Clea.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Can everyone see my screen okay? Just a quick check.
Yes, you look great.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, it's so nice to be here with you all. Thank you for coming. That was a wonderful presentation, Ren. You make it really hard to follow. As Stephanie just said, my name is Clea Harrelson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a current Knauss Marine Policy Fellow working at the National Science Foundation. I'm speaking to you today virtually from Washington, D.C., and I wanted to just take a quick moment to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan and the Piscataway peoples, and from land where white colonists enslaved Black and Indigenous people. And I think it's important to start with this framing because understanding the histories of land and sea and the people who live, work, and play there is important to the presentation that I'll be giving today on what the fishing community, and specifically a few sectors of that, scallop fishers, multi-species ground fishers, think about the protection of shipwrecks and the ways in which coastal communities are intimately tied to and part of our environment. And although this wasn't the primary focus of the research I'll be discussing, race and politics are important to understanding why people fishing, working, traveling, living along the New England coast got there in the first place, and how once they died, we became interested in telling their stories. And none of this is accident or coincidence. And so putting this project in the context of real people is really important to me because also often when we think about scientific research, we think about objectivity and the removal of the people and the scientist from the project. However, all science is done by people. And so to help frame this project, I'll also give you a brief introduction to me. And so to start, that's where we'll start, my background. Then I'll dive into the main topic for today's presentation, shipwreck protection in the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. And finally, we'll go over a few conclusion slides to discuss why any of this matters and why it matters for people who may never see these shipwreck sites in person. So and questions, of course. As I mentioned, I'm currently working as a Knauss Marine Policy Fellow based in the National Science Foundation. However, my journey started years ago in Tennessee, in my hometown, Hickman County, these pictures here, where I became fascinated with people and the land in a very different and non-marine context. But a place nonetheless where people rely on the landscape. There's rolling hills and shale creeks and all the organisms and the life that they support. Dotted across my home county, as with many places, there are signs talking about the history of a given building or a site. You can see one in the top right corner of the screen here. And I always wondered as a kid, who puts up these signs? And it wasn't until much later in my graduate studies and my work with the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary that I got to come back to this question about historical representation and how we talk about and memorialize places. So I worked with the staff at the National Marine Sanctuary at Stellwagen Bank for 2 summers, in part on my thesis project, which I won't talk about today, and also on this shipwreck project. And so you can't quite put street signs in the ocean, but it's the same basic principle. Folks within the sanctuary and the community are interested in marking and protecting important sites, in this case shipwrecks, and in telling their stories. And so this project at its core is about assessing ongoing protection efforts, learning about how people who are important users of sanctuary space, people who fish, think about shipwreck protection. So what is Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary? I could tell you I'm a very visual person though, so I'm going to play this short video clip so that you can see some of Stellwagen as I narrate a brief description of it. So Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary was created by the Ocean Act of 1992. It's 842 square miles large. For reference, Rhode Island is just a little bigger at 1,200. The sanctuary lies entirely in federal waters, and it's an underwater plateau, as you can see from this map. One person I worked with described it by saying the smell changes, the look of the water changes. And another person described the bank as having an intensity in terms of species and abundance that's really unique in this New England setting. The sanctuary is also one of 15 national marine sanctuaries and 2 national monuments managed by NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. And I'll note that dumping, mining, construction of platforms, and other non-fishery uses are prohibited, but disturbance to the bottom by traditional fisheries operations is allowed. And you're seeing some of that landscape now, and you're seeing Stellwagen's place within this larger National Marine Sanctuary system. So I'll stop there and try to get back to slides. Perfect. Stellwagen Bank, as you saw those beautiful images, it sits right at the crossroads of maritime traffic to and from the Atlantic Ocean and along the eastern seaboard. And the sanctuary has been transited over the centuries by many, many thousands of ships, unfortunately, some of which have suffered tragic accidents. And I want to emphasize that these shipwrecks are only one aspect of the sanctuary's maritime and cultural heritage. Approximately 12 to 11,000 years ago, it's likely that Paleo-Indians inhabited these areas and exploited the rich marine resources found along their shore. And so there's still a lot of work to be done in understanding how that rich history of Indigenous peoples and current history of Indigenous peoples in this region is represented in the sanctuary landscape. But for today, we're focusing on the shipwrecks. A total of 47 shipwrecks have been located. 12 of those have been identified by name, and we're quite convinced that there's hundreds more yet to be discovered. There's been so much traffic in this area, it's almost inevitable. So known shipwrecks are a mix of passenger vessels, coal and granite carrying schooners, modern and historic fishing vessels, some of which sank as far back as the late 1800s. So just to prime you, a few well-known shipwrecks in the sanctuary include the steamship the Portland, also known as the Titanic of the New England, the Eastern Rig Dragger, the Edna G, which is one of my favorites, and the Patriot. And to date, 6 shipwreck sites containing 7 vessels have been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So we've heard from these videos, and you've heard from my brief description what shipwrecks mean at sort of a high level. There's lots of history here. They're time capsules into the past. But I'd love it if you could type into the chat just for a second what you think is the value of shipwrecks, or why we might be interested in protecting these places at all in the first place. And we'll come back to those answers at the end in the Q&A session and compare to what other folks who I actually interviewed said about benefits of shipwrecks. So talking about threats to shipwrecks, why do we need to protect them in the first place? They're sitting on the bottom of the ocean. Well, it turns out fishing gear impacts, particularly from scallop dredging, were identified in both the sanctuary's 2020 condition report and its most recent management plan as one of the greatest threats to these archaeological resources. Shipwrecks resting in shallow waters on top of the bank, for them, natural degradation and storms and currents are also, of course, a threat in the long term. However, every shipwreck visited by sanctuary researchers shows some sign of fishing gear through present entanglement and or through indications of past contact with fishing gear. And so the presence of derelict fishing gear not only can immediately impact a site, but it can reduce access to that shipwreck site for other users, such as divers. It can increase the risk of entanglement for both divers and wildlife. And if mobile gear is towed through a wreck or its debris field, which is kind of like the area around the shipwreck that may also contain artifacts, they can disperse those artifacts and other ship materials, making future site research more difficult or lessening that site's quality as a dive destination or as habitat for other marine life. And then, of course, shipwrecks also impact the safety of fishers. Gear entanglement, getting one of these large scallop dredges shown on the bottom of the screen here, caught on particularly steel-hulled shipwrecks, can be a real threat, and in extreme cases can sink smaller fishing vessels. So to reduce contact between fishing gear and wrecks, increase the safety of fishers operating in the area, in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 21, the sanctuary publicly disclosed the locations of several shipwrecks. And this marked a really notable change from past sanctuary policy in which shipwreck locations were kept confidential to prevent the removal of artifacts. So this is actually a really big shift in sanctuary policy, and one that has implications for many other sanctuaries and MPAs broadly. And it came about because as the maritime heritage continued to grow in the mid-2000s, it was increasingly clear that unlike in sites where these shipwrecks are really accessible, like in the Florida Keys, the importance of Stellwagen as an ongoing and important commercial fishing ground made contact with fishing gear a greater potential threat than sort of looting or other sort of misuse of these sites by recreational users. So they started the Shipwreck Avoidance Program, where fishers were notified of certain shipwreck locations, anywhere between 7 to 4, depending on the year, and also fishing grounds for that year. Different area closures and that sort of thing influenced which wrecks were selected. They got a bulletin on the NOAA Fisheries website, a VMS message issued near the beginning of the fishing season for some years, a hard copy letter in the mail, or in 2020, an email describing these shipwreck locations. And so I'll be focusing on data collected during 2019 and 2020 interview sessions that followed the release of this information to fishers. So they got the bullets, they had their fishing season, and then I followed up to see how it all went. And this research focuses on 3 primary questions. First, did the information about shipwreck locations actually reach the target audience? Did they get the notices? 2, did it change their behavior once they got the notice? And 3, what do fishers really think about shipwreck protection, and how can their views help us better inform future iterations of this project and ensure that we have buy-in for shipwreck protection going forward? So data were collected during June and July of 2019 and 2020 through a total of 42 semi-structured interviews, 3 of which were in person. COVID also impacted my ability to continue to interview people in person, which was a real shame, but phone interviews were a wonderful stand-in. My study population was people who had, in theory, received the notice about shipwreck disclosure. So that, in this case, meant Northern Gulf of Maine scallop permit holders and also folks with multi-species groundfish permits. And I really focused on semi-structured interviews because for both years of these interviews, to gather data that was rich in detail and to have a format that really allowed folks to help us understand what they think is important about shipwreck protection, in addition to answering our own questions. And as a clarifying note, the names of the folks that I interviewed and their direct responses and identifying features were kept confidential, so it wasn't shared directly with the NOAA staff, which I was working with. And of course, this was all approved by my university IRB, the University of Rhode Island. So we'll dig into some results. Who did I actually talk to? We talked to 41 white men and 1 white woman. Average age ranged from 19 to 70 years old. Fishers reported 22 unique ports across 3 different states, Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. And folks had an average of 29 years of fishing experience with a maximum of 50 years, which is a long time to be fishing. Out of the 42 fishers, 23 primarily fished for scallops, 16 for groundfish, and 3 fished for both very regularly every year. In addition to their primary target species, multiple people also listed, a number of add-on permits for lobster, tuna, squid, charter fishing, and other permits in state waters. Average boat length was 41 feet, although many fishers reported having worked on vessels of varying sizes over their career, so they were drawing on that depth of experience. And while the majority of people reported using a scallop dredge as their primary form of fishing gear, makes sense, we talked to a lot of scallop fishers, there were also folks with bottom trawls, rod and reel, gill nets, and hand lines. So getting into a bit of the results, we had a number of wonderful recommendations, and I'll note too that all of this data was sent back to the people that I interviewed to verify if it made sense with them as a way to sort of help ensure that my results are as accurate as possible. So first, we found that using multiple communication methods is important to reach a diverse range of fishers. Out of the 42 fishers interviewed across 2019 and 2020, 30 fishers, or about 71%, were aware of shipwreck avoidance guidelines. So they received some form of this message. Hard copy letters sent in the mail reached a higher proportion of vessel captains than emails that were sent. And while the majority of fishers preferred letters in the mail as the primary form of communication, nearly half of those interviewed in 2020 recommended additional and alternative forms of communication to help boost awareness. So for example, using both a letter and an email and social media and some other form of communication was seen by one person as a way to bridge differences among, quote, old school and new school fishers who may have varying degrees of comfort with technology. Next, communication methods are not uniform in impact, right? It's not just about the information itself or how it's said, it's about who's saying it. So peer-to-peer sharing, as well as other communication methods, such as social media or partnerships with popular fishing organizations, were viewed as a way to elevate the visibility of a notice about shipwreck avoidance, and also to positively alter how fishers perceive that notice. So one fisher from 2019 described the importance of particular groups and people in the industry by saying, when the executive director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association sends an email, I always read it. So leveraging those partnerships is important, and building a network of communication outlets that go beyond the sort of traditional official forms of communication through NOAA was really perceived as key to expanding viewership and interest in shipwreck protection. Next, most vessel captains were also very open to the use of technology to aid in shipwreck protection efforts. 4 felt that, receiving things such as like USBs with shipwreck locations in a format that was well suited for the plotter or the navigation device that they use on their boats would be really helpful. Partnering with existing popular apps was also mentioned, with one person saying, they don't leave the dock before checking their mobile device for things such as like the NOAA buoy reports or the weather apps. And so having a notice about shipwreck locations at the beginning of the season that's tied to one of those popular tools could be a really good way to get the message out. 2 captains also said that sending vessel monitoring system messages, so using that onboard communication system for the vessel, was really helpful because it put the important information right where they needed it on the boat. And additionally, folks thought 19 out of 28 in the year 2020 believed that vessel monitoring system technology could be used both to send messages to boats that are out there through geofencing technology, which would create sort of an invisible fence around a shipwreck site that then once a fisher passed into that zone, they would receive a message, could be useful. And also that there's different ways to change the accuracy with which vessel monitoring systems track boat activity, right? So you can increase what they call the ping rate and get a more accurate track of what vessels are going where. And fishers were open to the use of these technologies as a way to increase awareness about these shipwreck sites themselves. Finally, most fishers are already aware of wreck locations, which was a really important and interesting finding, right? So only 4 out of 41 fishers in 2019 and 2020 reported of learning of new wrecks through this notice. These fishers mostly listed their home ports in Maine. So they were coming from out of town to fish on Stellwagen Bank and weren't aware of they didn't have the full wreck book or list of sites for this area. And multiple fishers acknowledged the utility of sharing these wreck locations for people new to the area, saying that this was a game changer and that this should be, standard practice to share wreck books across fishing. And so as a result of this widespread awareness about shipwreck locations, most fishers felt that sharing the location of the shipwreck itself did not significantly impact their behavior. They told me over and over again, we already know what's out there, but we appreciate you sending it again. They were positive about this type of feedback, but felt that they already had that knowledge for the most part. And this is just a map showing some of those locations of shipwrecks, kind of placing them on the bank. So you can see that there's a few that are clustered down at the bottom, and there are also some that are quite widespread and spread out from each other. So a few other pieces of results. One of the most interesting ones to me was that fishers want to know more about the individual shipwreck sites and the purpose of shipwreck protection. So across 2019 and 2020 interviews, 32 out of 42 fishers reported at least one benefit, often multiple, to preserving shipwrecks. Perceived benefits included protection for the sake of historic value, the creation of structural habitat that would allow marine life to prosper, the use of wrecks for recreational diving, preservation of memorial sites, and finally the use of wrecks for research in and of itself. So the majority of those who reported benefits stated that they viewed these sites as having broad historic value. That was about 15 people. One person summarized this by saying, "I just think there's something beneficial about saving a piece of the past. Everything I know about fishing here is gone besides these wrecks." And so for him, it was a really important concept. Next, although fishers were not directly questioned on the topic, 11 out of 41 fishers interviewed expressed concern that the current voluntary guidelines for shipwreck avoidance may lead to future closures. One fisher said, "I know what this leads to. This leads to closed areas around this wreck." So there was absolutely concern about future work and interest in staying engaged in the process and having these be voluntary guidelines. So based on this research, efforts to share shipwreck locations have been successful in sharing that information in and of itself. But the sanctuary can do more to articulate why shipwreck protection is important and how this benefits fishers. And so why does this matter? It matters because we know that most fishers who were targeted received the notice and that we can improve dissemination methods, and that showing that the sanctuary is responsible to these views is a way to build trust within this community. And this research is also important to help shape the larger narrative of why shipwrecks are important by reflecting the values of the people who actually live there. So I want to take a quick second, I know we're getting close to time, just to think about a place that you love, a landscape or a building or the street corner on your morning walk, and why you like it. Maybe it's the perfect midway point between work and coffee. Maybe it's a piece of a parkland where you visited every summer growing up. And I know that not all places need to be preserved, right? But when many people begin valuing a place or finding that connection in a similar way, it changes how we interact with that space. There's community in those common values. And sometimes hearing how other people value a given space changes what you see in that landscape. So management of shipwrecks at Stellwagen is both driven by the values of people who are managing it and helps shape how folks value these sites. And so through effective management, we can better reconnect people to place. And this matters for people who, grew up far away from the ocean too, even those from Tennessee, because we rely on the trade networks developed in towns like Boston, built by people who worked on the ocean. Many of our ancestors relied on ferries and coastal travel that helped them move to and settle in new towns that directly influence where we live now. So what happens on the coast has far-reaching impacts and still impacts us today. And as a result, it's important to keep interrogating that history. And we can't do that if we let key historical artifacts slip away from us. And second, throughout this presentation, I hope you've taken away the concept that valuation of history has to be bottom up as well, and that the voices of the people who are represented in the New England seascapes are essential for building effective and equitable protection for shipwrecks and other cultural sites. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much to all those who shared their knowledge with me during these interviews, to those at the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, in particular Ben Haskell, the deputy director there, and also the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, who supported this research, and finally to my advisor in this project, Dr. Tracy Dalton at the University of Rhode Island. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. There were 5 responses, but before we get into that, I just want to remind the audience that we do have lots of time for your questions, about 11 minutes. So if you would enter your questions in the questions chat box in the toolbox there, we would be very happy to share them with Clea. Also, Clea has shared her slides. So if you look under handouts, you can also access the slides that she shared with us today. So when you asked people to enter information about why, what would be important about shipwrecks, 5 people responded. One person said artificial reef habitat. Another person said potentially unmolested historical context. Another person said understanding our society through place-based cultural history.
Oh, that's a good one.
Another person said preserving our history so we can improve from it, definitely. And this last one was to help us learn about ourselves and our past to the stories of these wrecks, culture, industry, technology.
Absolutely. Oh, those are such thoughtful responses. Thank you for those who put a comment in. And I think those are really well aligned with what Fisher's thought as well. And I didn't dive into all of those details in this presentation immediately, but it was really a robust response from people who were maybe initially a little, cautious about talking to me, cautious about what it meant to be thinking about protection in the sanctuary space. The relationship between NOAA fisheries and the sanctuary in New England with that fishing fleet, as if anyone is aware of that context, is really complicated. But once we started telling stories about shipwrecks, it was really, really wonderful and heartwarming and really valuable, rich information to hear people share the depth of connection they have with some of these places and to talk about friends who've been lost at sea and what it means to them to know that those places still exist and to know that this is a part of their professional, personal, cultural heritage. So thank you for putting those comments in.
Absolutely. This next question is both a compliment for you and a question, I think, for me. It says, Clea, thank you for this excellent presentation. Very well done. Is it possible to obtain a link to the recording of the talk? And we are recording this right now. The link to the webinar will be in our YouTube channel for NOAA Central Library. And I did add the YouTube URL in the chat box. It would be under your questions chat box. So please join it. It probably won't be uploaded for another couple of hours because it'll take a little time, but check for it later today. Also, we did get another question. This question asks, where can we learn more about shipwrecks in our local areas?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would say it depends on where your local area is, and I'd be happy to help you track down some of those resources. It's a pretty, I would say, when you think about the field of marine archaeology, which I'm by no means an expert in, so I feel free to stand to correct me, but it's a pretty young field compared to terrestrial archaeology. And so what you actually might find useful is finding folks who dive in your areas. And often there's dive clubs or sort of informal community groups like that are really, really wonderful resources for finding out that type of background in your area. I would also say there's a lot of work that's based in universities and that sort of research side. And so reaching out to those local universities and departments might be a good resource. And then I will say, NOAA has national marine sanctuaries all around the coast of the country. And so those are a great resource, and in the Great Lakes as well. With a new one just designated in the Great Lakes, actually. So those are wonderful places to check in about cultural heritage as well.
Someone in the audience also said that for Massachusetts, go to the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeology. So thank you for that
Absolutely.
comment. Another question asks, were there any demographic trends on views on shipwrecks?
That's a really good question. It's not something we went into detail with for this presentation, but there were in general, I would say. And so one of the things that was really interesting is that there's a real disparity in the age ranges of people that we talk to often for these kind of interviews. And so I found that, when I was talking to folks who had less than, let's say 3 years of fishing experience, there was a lot of excitement and openness to thinking about shipwrecks as sites of sort of research, as sites of like, how can we use this to make fishing better in the future when thinking about it as natural habitat and that sort of piece. And I would say that those who had more experience in the industry or who've just been out there doing their work longer often talked about them first as memorial sites or talked about them first as part of sort of the legacy of fishing in New England or for their particular sector. So I'd say that was a really interesting divide. And then in addition, in terms of technology, as you might imagine, there was a pretty strong divide in folks who were really comfortable with things like VMS or comfortable, and some folks even recommended, hey, send me a text. That was a lot of the younger folks too. Whereas there were a few older folks who, reported not checking their emails, who reported hard copies as really the only way you could reach them. And so that was really interesting as well, which is why you need a mix, because there's no one particular person who is a New England fisher.
find that very interesting, actually. This one last comment is a compliment. It's great presentation in Project Clea. Shout out from SBNMS staff and SAC.
That's so fun. Stellwagen Bank on the call.
Absolutely. All right, it looks like that might be our last comment. Thank you so much again for your presentation. And to the audience, if you know anyone who would be interested in Renner Clea's work, please share the recording of this webinar, which will be uploaded to the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel in just a few hours. And I'd also like to conclude by thanking our speakers for sharing their research with us today. And I'm very appreciative to you, Stephanie, for hosting today's webinar. So best of luck with all of your Knauss fellowships. We hope you'll join us again for the next Knauss Lunch and Learn webinar, which will be on Thursday, November 18th at noon Eastern Standard Time. And just again, thank you for joining us. NOAA Central Library is very proud to present the work of the NOAA community in general and to support the Knauss Fellows specifically. Thank you for watching.